vampires aren't real.
Oh, yes, they are. And you know they are.
So, do you fancy something vampiric this Christmas? If the answer is yes, then you may want to check out Red Snow. This one is directed and written by Sean Nicholas Lynch, and is essentially a horror comedy romantic film that takes potshots of the romantic style vampire fiction that we've seen from the likes of Anne Rice and Stephanie Myers. In actual fact, they're actually name checked in the movie. It features this character called Olivia, who is an aspiring writer herself, and she's taking a break in a cabin that her mother left her in Lake Tahoe, which is kind of a snowy area, at least at this time of year, around Christmas. And she's kind of settled there all on her own, somewhat of a lonely soul, you might say. And she's just kind of sitting there trying to kind of write her novel, hoping to get published. However, circumstances are about to change as she happens upon a wounded bat. And in actual fact, it turns out this bat is actually a vampire called Luke, who she ends up kind of taking care of. And there they kind of form a bond, but there may be other factors at play here as well. What will happen? You just have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's discuss Red Snow. So this is a kind of a knowing wink and a nudge at the kind of, as I say, the Twilight movies and kind of over-romanticised films. This one kind of trying to kind of turn that trope on its head, but at the same time trying to tell a somewhat of a romantic story in its kind of in its own right, with a few kind of laughs and kills along the way. So I have to say, this movie does have an original feel to it, because although it does have elements of the very things that it's actually kind of sending up, the way this kind of movie is produced makes it kind of fresh and original, and somewhat unlike the majority of the romanticised kind of vampire fictions that we've kind of seen thus far. I have to say our lead character of Olivia is absolutely a fantastic character. I think giving a real good performance by the actress here, making her a very likeable kind of character, but somewhat kind of quirky and kind of offbeat at the kind of the same time. And she does come across as vulnerable and almost fangirls out when she finds out that she has a real life kind of hunky vampire in her garage. And I have to say I quite like the interactions between them. And it's kind of a somewhat kind of, you can kind of buy into the relationship that these two characters have. Lucas, this kind of wounded vampire who seems to have a little bit of a shady past that he's a little bit kind of like unwilling to reveal initially. And Olivia, who is this wide-eyed kind of fangirl, knowing that she's got her kind of ideal man in the garage there, but there are still some danger signs that she's got to kind of overcome. And then we have these other threats here of these outside forces. There are other vampires and there's also a vampire hunter. And what kind of threat will these pose? It makes it for a very compelling story, I have to say, with some interesting and quirky characters that you feel like, as I say, is somewhat fresh and things you've not quite seen before. Now the movie still does have some elements of traditional kind of vampire lore here. We do get a couple of kind of brutal kind of kill scenes, lots of kind of gore effects that are all done in a kind of a practical way and look pretty good, I have to say. The vampires, when they are on a kind of a more of a violent killing spree, do look vicious. I kind of quite enjoyed the makeup. It's not overdone, but they still do seem somewhat bestial. The prosthetics involving kind of like, heads that are getting pulled off, blood, all looks pretty good, I have to say. And even our kind of our lesser characters, we have a kind of vampire hunter played by Vernon Wells, and there's kind of like these two other vampires that kind of show up. It's particularly the female vampire, I think, again makes for sort of compelling characters. And we see that even though some characters may, for example, like the vampires, have some shared characteristics, they still are differences in kind of personality, which is overall a pretty good tale of storytelling here, I have to say, from Lynch, the kind of the writer-director. So I thought that generally speaking, this movie actually flowed pretty well and was very watchable And as I say, the acting I thought was all very good. The characterization was all good. I've overall had an affinity for horror movies kind of set in a snowy wilderness, because you just have that pure white sort of snow there, giving this kind of this stark contrast when you have kind of blood splattered on it, and that horror kind of spread over this kind of otherwise seemingly kind of beautiful kind of landscape and stuff like that. So I think it's very kind of well photographed here. And the movie does have a few kind of original ideas, and it's fun seeing a film having kind of swipes at movies like Twilight and things like that, but still having some reverence for it, I have to say, without kind of completely kind of becoming a spoof or kind of tearing down, obviously, the popularity. And I do think, for example, fans of Twilight won't be put off by this. They'll still kind of enjoy it to a certain degree, even though it does take a few kind of pot shots at maybe their kind of favourite franchise there. But I still feel it has enough kind of respect to go there. There's a couple of kind of neat kind of character turns here that I quite enjoyed as well. Not everything is always as it seems necessarily. That was all kind of quite fun. What doesn't work for me, the movie is somewhat small in scale, I have to say, and it feels very kind of self-contained. The majority of this film taking place in simply this cabin with two people kind of having kind of conversations. So you don't feel like you're really kind of seeing much of this particular world. Other things are kind of hinted at. We have this kind of an organisation that is brought in through the movie, and it kind of feels a little bit like that's somewhat of a kind of underdeveloped idea here. And we kind of get hints that it may be one thing or another, but you never really feel like it's kind of explored that much. We have 3 vampires on screen, and I think our main kind of vampire, Luke, who is this one that Liv is having a little bit of a relationship, and the kind of the female vampire are very well defined. The third one, however, he just doesn't get anything to do other than kind of like stand around and kind of looking fearsome, and he's the one actor I would say overdoes that a little bit, constantly kind of baring his fangs and looking a little bit unnatural. And I've always kind of said in vampire movies, when you have kind of actors overly kind of like showing their fangs to say that they're a vampire, it looks kind of unnatural, because a creature that has fangs as part of their anatomy wouldn't feel the need to constantly kind of like show the audience all the time. They would just be there. So there's a couple of kind of like minor kind of niggles here and there, and you ultimately feel that the movie is, it's kind of fun, but somewhat low impact, I have to say. But overall, it's an enjoyable film. It's not exactly action-packed, but it's still an enjoyable, fun ride, filled with kind of quirky characters and kind of neat ideas. And if you kind of want a movie that still has a romantic side to it, but also maybe takes a little bit of a loving jab at the kind of the overly kind of romanticised movies, it kind of manages to straddle both those kind of areas. So I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.